Hello everyone and welcome to my The Bold and Beautiful Always channel. Taylor's terrible news, Ridge dives in while Brooke flies off Nick's boat. Brooke Logan thought she was stuck in a hurricane, but Nick Marone's beautiful boat, the Serendipity, rocked softly on the Pacific surf. The bright LA cityscape visible over the ocean seemed like a painted background to a hideous play for which she had not tried out. The polished teak beneath her bare feet felt strange, and the salty air tasted like ash. Only a few hours prior, she had stood in front of Eric Forrester, shaking and saying, "I'm marrying Nick," as if she were pulling at her own heart. After Ridge's near-death experience saved her, she had presented it as a quest for stability and a haven from the bone-deep dread of the cliff collapse and the oppressive darkness of the Pacific. The falsehood, however, made her stomach turn as she looked at the diamond engagement ring Nick had just placed on her finger, a cold, heavy weight where Ridge's touch should have been. Consistency? It was like falling. Nick's smug grin, his protective arm across her shoulders, and his whispered assurances about their new beginning, every word felt like a shackle being tightened. With the power of a rogue wave, the gravity of her decision, a decision made in the numb aftermath of trauma and Ridge's terrible withdrawal after Taylor's confession, crushed over her. Nick was her choice. The harsh and horrifying reality was a cage. Behind her eyes, Ridge's pale visage flashed, marked with a betrayal that went deeper than any ocean trench. It wasn't stability she saw in Nick's eyes now, rather, it was the smug satisfaction of the winner claiming a prize that she suddenly realized, with horrifying clarity, should never have been his. She remembered his body going completely still against the rocks after saving her, the agonizing silence where his breath should have been. Her lungs were gripped by a chilly, biting panic. She was having trouble breathing. She was being choked by the yacht, the ring, and Nick's touch. She had to leave. Right now. Prior to the vows, this was final. Before this horrible, self-inflicted error drowned her. She said, "Nick," in a strained whisper that was almost audible over the soft splash of water against the hull. Her motions were clumsy and frantic as she withdrew from his hug. Her eyes were wide, panicked, and unable to meet his gaze as she made a vague gesture towards the far shore, saying, I need air. Real air. Off the boat." A glint of distress took the place of Nick's smile. With a firm, anchoring hold, he reached for her hand once more and said, "Brooke, honey, we are getting air. Beautiful ocean air. This is our celebration. Relax. Everything's perfect now." Excellent. It was called a branding iron. Ideal for him. Not for her. If it meant being away from Ridge, it would never be for her. The notion was a flash of sheer, pure dread. No, the denial ripped from her, raw and urgent, louder than she meant. She stumbled back a step as she yanked her hand free. Tears clouded her eyes as she said, "It's not perfect. It's wrong. All of it. I can't do this." She turned away from the cabin and towards the broad sea that separated her from the land and, more importantly, from him. Another second stuck on this boat with the repercussions of her decision seemed more scary than the sheer plunge to the black lake below. Primal flight took the place of logic. Still wearing the sundress she'd worn for her engagement lunch, Brooke Logan clambered onto the polished gunnel before Nick could react or his confused yell could fully form. She hovered there for a heart-stopping moment, a figure of pure, frantic escape, silhouetted against the wide blue sky. Then she pushed away with a choking sob that was a mixture of fear and freedom. A startling memory of the horror she had experienced weeks prior, the plunge into the Pacific was a blast of cold that took her breath away. As she arose, coughing and gasping, salt water filled her mouth and nostrils. Overhead, the yacht appeared enormous. Nick was shouting and making frantic gestures, his speech muffled by the water in her ears. She didn't turn around. Panic was overpowered by survival instinct. Take a swim. The shore. With the weight of her wet clothes dragging at her, she launched herself into a desperate, ungainly crawl, the shore suddenly seeming so far away. She swam not only for shore but also away from the oppressive destiny she had nearly accepted, in the direction of Ridge, the only thing that counted. She needed to go to him. She had to admit her mistake to him. That was not the end of that fate. Ridge Forrester had no intention of being close to the marina. Eric's 3 words, "she chose Nick," had been haunting him while he drove aimlessly, a constant, excruciating soundtrack blaring over the wreckage of his life. Brooke's decision had exploded his soul, and Taylor's deception about Steffi had shattered his identity. The irony left him with a sour taste in his mouth as he parked close to the cliffs and gazed blindly at the water that had almost claimed them both. She had voluntarily sailed into Nick Marone's arms after he had battled the sea for her. His numbness was broken by the piercing, frightened sound of distant shouting. His neck pricked with instinct, refined by decades of adoring Brooke Logan. He exited his vehicle and made his way to the marina's edge, his steps heavy yet motivated by an unidentified fear. Then he noticed it, Nick's yacht, the Serendipity, with its sleek lines. As well as the person in the water. Pale skin, a desperate fight against the waves, and a glimmer of familiar blonde hair. Brooke. Time crystallized rather than slowed. Ridge's body was screaming "No" from every cell. Never again. Not in this manner. Not after everything. He was physically struck by the memory of her lifeless body in the murky water weeks before. It was all there, visceral and instantaneous, the memory of his own lungs wailing for breath, his muscles weakening, the awful silence. More strong than the anguish, more powerful than the betrayal, more powerful than the soul-crushing tiredness that still gnawed at his bones, something more primordial raged beneath the terror: protect Brooke. It was ingrained in his being and could not be changed by deception or decision. Eric's statement disappeared. Taylor's confession fell apart. Brooke in the water was the only thing that was genuine. Once more. Relying on him. Once more. He made no hesitation. Didn't consider. He was still healing from the last time he had pushed his body over its breaking point, so he didn't consider the cost to his own injured body. He took off running. His complete focus was on the shortest line to the water, his shoes scrapping on the pavement and his jacket thrown aside in the middle of his stride. From the deck, Nick was shouting, pointing, and hurriedly lowering a dinghy. Ridge chose to ignore him. The ancient, deep-seated pain from his near-drowning flared like a warning siren as he approached the end of the pier, his lungs already burning from the effort. He was aware of the consequences of diving in. He was aware that this time his body might not comply. He was aware that he might not come up. Nick was her choice. It was a nasty last twist of the knife, but the notion made no difference. Brooke was submerged. He plunged in. The cold was a familiar, unwanted hug, and the impact was startling. A phantom echo of his own suffocation, the shock of it, the abrupt immersion, caused an instantaneous, visceral dread. His chest clenched terribly, and his breath caught. No. Not right now. Not when she's dependent on me. He kicked hard to combat the growing fear, making his arms cut through the water. Due to the dreadful constriction in his chest and lingering weakness, his motions were not as forceful as they had been previously. Every kick was a defiance of his body's objections, and every stroke was an act of will. He concentrated on Brooke's head, which was bobbing farther out, and her strokes were becoming weaker as the river pulled her down and her garment weighed her down. The motor of Nick's dinghy was wheezing to life as it touched the water. Ignoring the heat in his muscles and the desperate, insufficient gulp for air, Ridge pushed harder. Nearly there. Logan, wait. Hold on. A wave swept over her head as he arrived. Her huge blue eyes were filled with horror when she surfaced, sputtering. Ridge, she said, her voice a mix of alarm and relief. With a strength that came from desperation, he locked his arm around her waist and gripped her. His breathing was shallow and ragged, and the cold and the exertion of swimming were already taking a terrible toll on him. "I've got you. I've got you," he rasped. Keeping her head above the chop, he drew her close while treading water fiercely. Her fingers dug into his shoulders as her body shook fiercely against his. "Don't fight me. Just hold on." Sputtering closer, Nick's dinghy made an obtrusive motor noise. "Brooke! Ridge! Grab the side," shouted Nick, who leaned down and held out his hand. With a flinch, Brooke pressed her face against Ridge's shoulder. Her words were a desperate, tear-streaked torrent on his neck, washing over him like the salt spray. "No! Ridge, please, don't let him take me back. I was wrong. So wrong. I don't want him. I want you. I always want you," she said. "I panicked. After the cliff, after Taylor, you were so distant. I thought it was over, but it's not. It can't be. Please, Ridge. Don't let go." Her admission, delivered in the frigid clutches of the Pacific, among breathless gulfs and paralyzing terror, hit Ridge like a punch to the body. Nick was her choice. But now she was choosing him, clinging to him, shaky and afraid. Her voice's unadulterated vulnerability, her fear of being returned to Nick, and her fervent request, all of these things got past the wall of resentment and treachery he had erected. In his chest, the flame of destiny, which he had thought had gone out, blazed up hot and searing. The Ridge Forrester, who defied oceans and logic for this woman, roared back to life as he tightened his hold and fixed his furious, protecting stare on hers. "I'm not letting go," he swore in a gruff yet uncompromising voice. With a wordless, primordial challenge emanating from his weary, water-stained face, he turned his head and met Nick's eyes across the lake. "Ever. I own her." Nick caught sight of it. Witnessed Brooke's complete rejection as she clung to her adversary, witnessed the unwavering grip, and witnessed the unadulterated adoration in Ridge's eyes. A total and devastating defeat swept across his face. He paused for a long time as the dinghy rocked and the motor idled. Then Nick fired the motor and swung the dinghy away, returning to the Serendipity, leaving them alone in the wide, frigid emptiness, with a quick, almost imperceptible nod, a sign of submission to a power he could never defeat. Brooke let out a sob as relief overcame her. Ridge, however, had no time for respite. Within his body, the cold, the emotional tsunami of her plea, the effort of the rescue, and the horrifying echo of his past drowning were all combining to create a perfect storm. He seemed to be breathing in short, ragged gasps that were not reaching his lungs. The old, familiar constriction was returning with scary speed, like if a vice were squeezing around his chest. Already shaking from exhaustion, his limbs felt leaden and unresponsive. He managed to say, "Okay," in a tight voice. He moved his hold, kicking feebly as he attempted to orient them towards the far-off harbor. "Okay, Logan. Let's get you to shore." However, the adrenaline rush and the sneaky reappearance of his pulmonary injury were rapidly depleting his strength. Every kick was an enormous effort, and every breath was a last-ditch, inadequate gulp of air. Instead of coming closer, the shore appeared to move away. By concentrating on Brooke's weight in his arms and her hushed cries against his skin, he resisted the growing panic. "Wait a moment. Hold on." Ridge's body started to seriously fail him when they were still a risky distance from the marina. He breathed in water rather than air when a wave struck his face. What little oxygen he had was stolen by the intense coughing spasm. The globe whirled. His vision tunneled, blurring at the edges. Now the cold was seeping into his own being, not just into his flesh. "Ridge?" Brooke asked, her voice piercing with fresh fear. "Ridge, breathe. Look at me, she said as she felt his hold slip a little and his kicks become weak, clumsy flutters. Ridge. No. Stay with me. Please. He made an effort. He tried, God. He concentrated on her face and her frightened eyes. He mustered all his last willpower. However, his lungs resisted expanding. Ineffectively, his diaphragm spasmed. With frightening finality, the ghost of his near death, the familiar, terrifying feeling of suffocation, came down. He gasped, the word a damp, choked murmur, "See can't." His eyes rolled a bit and he lost concentration as his head lolled back. He was sinking not only because of the water but also because his supplies were being so drastically depleted. For her, he had pushed too hard and too quickly. Once more. In a frenzy, Taylor Hayes arrived at the marina. Since hearing from a distressed Eric about Brooke's flight onto Nick's boat and Ridge's subsequent absence, she had been anxiously phoning Ridge. Eric had exuded a tangible and infectious terror. Taylor was aware of Ridge's emotional and physical fragility. It was unimaginable that he would be in danger close to water or Brooke. She saw Eric standing close to the edge of the pier, his face pale, binoculars focused on the lake. She followed his stare, and her heart ceased. Far out, Ridge and Brooke, clinging to each other. Ridge's motions were frighteningly slow, and his head was lolling. Brooke was yelling as she attempted to support him, her own strength obviously fading. A Coast Guard ship, probably notified by Nick or Marina Security, was heading in their direction, but it was painfully slow. Taylor didn't hold out. Ignoring the frigid water and the danger, she threw off her shoes and rushed down the closest dock access ramp. She needed to assist. She was to blame for this. Everything. Ridge had fallen into this pit of sorrow as a result of her deception, which allowed Brooke to make this awful decision. Feeling guilty and desperate for atonement, she dove into the water and struck out with strong strokes that she had developed during years of sports. Ridge fell entirely slack and became a lifeless weight in Brooke's arms as she arrived. With her own power gone, Brooke was sobbing uncontrollably while attempting to hold his head above water. Taylor grabbed Ridge's other arm and looped it over her shoulders, shouting, "Brooke! Here! Help me!" Together, they were able to maintain his face above the water while he kicked frantically in the direction of the Coast Guard boat that was coming. They were drenched and shivering when hands reached down and pulled them onto the deck. Paramedics rushed to Ridge right away. He had no discernible rise and fall in his chest, was as pale as death, and had blue-tinged lips. Orders to begin CPR, attach oxygen, and be ready for transfer were yelled by the lead medic. Ridge's chest was being rhythmically compressed, which was a terrifying sight. Wrapped in a blanket, Brooke fell onto the deck, trembling furiously, her eyes staring at Ridge's lifeless body as tears ran down her cheeks. She spoke in a broken voice, "He saved me, again, and I broke him." Taylor crouched next to her, soaking, her own face scarred with guilt and fear, holding Brooke's cold hand and expressing mutual suffering. Flashing lights, yelled medical language, and the terrible, unrelenting sound of the ambu bag pumping air into Ridge's lungs made the voyage back to shore a terrifying haze. He didn't respond. With sirens blaring, he was taken to a waiting ambulance at the dock. Brooke's ragged weeping and the desperate hammering of their own hearts were the only sounds to break the oppressive quiet as Brooke and Taylor clambered into Eric's waiting car and followed the ambulance to the hospital. In the fluorescent prison of the intensive care unit waiting room, hours passed slowly. Grim-faced doctors came and went. Ridge was critical but stabilized. Severe weariness, heart strain, subsequent drowning, and respiratory difficulty. He was struggling on a ventilator. Once more. The picture was a vicious rerun of the weeks before, a vicious cycle of pain for which Brooke felt entirely accountable. Taylor paced as her guilt consumed her like a living creature. Sitting stoically, Eric exuded a silent, heartbroken rage. Hope hung by a thread, weak and frail. At last a doctor appeared, looking tired but not as stressed. He declared, "He's holding his own," causing everyone to sigh uneasily. A wave of uncertain and overpowering relief swept over Brooke. The ventilator is doing the work for him now. He's deeply sedated. The next 24 hours are critical for his lungs and heart to recover from the strain. But, he's strong. He has a chance. She buried her face in her hands as she slid into a chair and muttered grateful prayers. Taylor wiped a tear from her eye. Eric gave her shoulder a squeeze. However, Taylor's relief didn't last long. Taylor stood away, the weight of her silent truth crushing her once more while Brooke sobbed with worn-out thankfulness and Eric spoke reassuring words. Ridge had almost lost his life once more. For Brooke, he had dived back into the sea that frightened him, pushing his fractured body to its breaking point. Due to the domino effect that her deception had caused. He was struggling for his life while laying in the chamber, reliant on machines to breathe. Furthermore, he was still unaware of Steffi's whole story. It festered inside her like poison, the secret she had borne, the falsehood that had fueled his desperation and seclusion. Her determination was strengthened when she saw how shattered and vulnerable he was, and how heroic his recent attempt had been. She couldn't allow him to discover yet another level of dishonesty. Not after this. Never again. The picture of him gasping for air on a hospital bed, sacrificed on the altar of her cowardice, outweighed the guilt, the fear of Steffi's response, and the terror of Ridge's rage. Taylor crept silently down the quiet hallway to Ridge's room as Brooke eventually fell asleep in a waiting room chair, tired and teary-eyed. The only sound was the ventilator's steady hiss and sigh. With tubes dangling from his mouth and arms and monitors blinking with constant, uncanny rhythms, he appeared frightfully frail. With her heart thumping her ribs, Taylor walked over to the bed. In a gesture infused with decades of complicated love and unending regret, she reached out with shaking fingers and delicately brushed a strand of damp hair from his forehead. "Ridge," she said in a tearful whisper, knowing he couldn't hear her, but she had to say it before her bravery gave out. She took a big, trembling breath, the sterile air scorching in her lungs, and said, "Oh, Ridge, you brave, impossible man." Truth was required by the room's silence and the vulnerability of the person in front of her. "You have to get better," she sobbed. Her voice trembled as she said, "You have to wake up. Because when you do." In the shadow of his sacrifice, she leaned closer, her lips close to his ear, finally letting out the terrible news she had been holding within for 30 years. It wasn't a confession to the aware man, but rather a last-ditch entreaty to his unconscious form. The words lingered in the antiseptic air, a terrible secret whispered to the rhythmic sigh of the machine breathing for him, a final, awful truth delivered to a man too broken to hear it, but whose entire world would shatter anew when he finally opened his eyes. "Steffi isn't yours. She's James Warwick's daughter. I lied. I'm so sorry. I'm so desperately sorry." With her face buried in her hands and her shoulders trembling from silent weeping, Taylor slumped onto the chair next to his bed. The weight of decades of lying, now exacerbated by the time of her confession, was murmured into the sterile silence as Ridge Forrester struggled to breathe once more.